Hey Phil, great to see you again. It's been a little while. Life keeps going on. We keep staying busy and doing things. How's your world today?
Oh, speak for yourself. I'm not staying busy. Ever since I stepped down as dean, things have slowed down a lot. But I'm doing fine. I've been enjoying my granddaughter she's been in California for a week and finally decided to poke her head and let us see her now that she's a high school graduate and trying to figure out what to do in college. How are things going with your family?
Everybody's doing great. Graduation for Brooke is coming up soon, and everything is good. Sharon and I just came back from a little bit of a vacation. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, if you didn't catch it, Dr. Nelson said he has plenty of free time. So feel free if you're looking for somebody who Dr. Nelson can fill in a role. There's a great opportunity, and I want to thank Nationwide for supporting us and for supporting my one-liners and our education and our conversations. And we'll have some fun discussing things today, Phil, because that discussion about you retiring from being the dean and education is a great platform for some discussions and topics that I think we can touch on today.
Yeah, I think so too. I think talking about the profession, the future of the profession and the future of education in general in veterinary medicine would be a good topic to address.
Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
Phil, from what I gather, I'm sure that there are a lot of other veterinary schools who would like a dean. I just heard that Eleanor Green is going to be is linked to the veterinary school that's starting in Arkansas. I've got to bet your email and phone are kind of getting pinged every once in a while, huh?
Yep, it is. It has been. And, we're going through another spate of veterinary schools opening, just like we did when North Carolina and Florida and Mississippi State opened around the same time. I don't think we're anywhere close to having to be worried about bursting a bubble in the veterinary profession. To say that 35 schools is enough doesn't quite sound right.
You don't know that's enough until you see what the road looks further down the road. I mean, right now, 35 schools is not enough, and there's still plenty of applicants. There's no shortage of people applying to veterinary schools to become a veterinarian.
You're definitely right there. I mean, 2 decades ago, when I was on the ECFEG committee, we were shipping off 300 Americans a year overseas to get educated as veterinarians. Population has grown. So the number of people that we're going to have that want to be veterinarians has also grown.
Yeah, it wasn't that long ago though. I remember, maybe it was 25 or 30 years ago where schools like Mississippi State had maybe 1.2 to 1.3 applications per seat.
Yeah. By the way, that wasn't Mississippi State. That was nationwide.
Right. But I thought specifically at one point in time, especially looking at in-state applicants from within Mississippi, the ratio was pretty.
Oh, well, yeah, when they were only taking Mississippi residents.
Right.
But even then, and that's because they were, that was a population of 2 million people in the entire state, right? But in the mid-90s, early to mid-90s, that was one of the arguments about Western. All of a sudden, we dropped from, I think, 4 applicants per seat to 1.9 applicants per seat. I don't know how you get a 9/10 of a person, but that's math for you.
They have a tough time doing surgery.
Okay, I'm not going to even go there.
Well, now at Western, we're at probably about 12 or 13 applicants per each seat. So
what we found though was that you have to be careful with numbers and what they seem to predict. when I was in Mississippi, one of the arguments against the veterinary at Mississippi State was that the veterinary profession was growing by one veterinarian a year in the state when you accounted for death and retirement. Well, and so the question was, if you're going to take 32 students a year, where are the other 31 going to work? And why should the state invest in the training of 31 students that are going to work elsewhere? Now, that's a rather myopic way of looking at it, since the 31 students they were training were their own residents, the state's residents. That in and of itself should have been enough to provide full participation in the occupational choices of America. But it was also misleading in that there were a lot of reasons why veterinarians weren't coming to the state of Mississippi. A lot of it had to do with the rural nature of Mississippi. And people who graduated from other schools were attracted to more metropolitan areas. We were beginning that shift from food animal to small animal medicine. But there was a much more deeper cultural reason. And we didn't discover that until we graduated our first class. We couldn't explain it until we graduated our first class. And when the first class graduated, half of them stayed in the state. Now, nobody bothered to ask, where did those jobs come from? Where did those 15 jobs come from that nobody expected to be there? And that ratio kind of held for the next 5 to 10 years. The other half of that first class went out of state, and within 5 years, 70% of them came back. And what we discovered was that, first of all, there was a pent-up demand for veterinary medicine in the state of Mississippi. There were many small towns that didn't have a veterinarian. And when they needed a veterinarian, the veterinarian had to travel. They had areas of 3 or 4 towns and townships that they covered. And they were being overwhelmed, but they were the only veterinarian in a 60-mile radius. When we started graduating Mississippi residents who wanted to be next to their parents and siblings, they went back to places like Guntown, Mississippi. They went back to towns that didn't have a veterinarian. And they became the part of the aristocracy of that town. They joined the school boards, the bank boards, the water boards. They became leaders in their community. And it's that social and civic development that we don't think about when we just look at numbers.
So the antithesis, in the late 90s, there was this school in Pomona, California, that had other healthcare colleges, and a president who said, I want to put a veterinary school in this community, and put together a program in response to needs within the state of California that were perceived that the veterinary school at Davis wasn't providing a sufficient number of graduates based upon the number of jobs in the state of California. And so there was a lot of task forces and committee meetings and discussion about numbers and statistics and veterinary medicine and the need in Southern California, et cetera. And eventually, out of those discussions and a very determined president of Western University, the College of Veterinary Medicine at Western University College of Health Sciences, was established in the early 2000s.
Well, it was actually established in the late 90s.
Right.
96, I believe, is when they hired the founding dean, Shirley Johnston.
Right.
And that's when the school began to form, essentially move from an idea to it, and to the first 2 employees, Dr. Johnston, the Johnstons. And I'm not sure I know what you mean by antithesis, but essentially Dr. Pomerantz was forward thinking enough to say this is a health science university. And he also saw the attraction of veterinary medicine and the fact that a veterinary school was simultaneously an attractive area to look into, as well as part of healthcare. He intuitively understood what One Health was about. And I wasn't here during the years before we accepted students and was given the go-ahead by the accreditation by the COE, but I understand that from the many meetings that he had to consult, he was convinced that Davis could not meet the needs of California, let alone the veterinary needs of the nation, when 32 million people lived in Southern California alone. It just made radical sense that California could support 2 veterinary schools, if not more.
Yeah, and the reason I said early 2000s is because, if I'm not incorrect, it was August of 2003 when the first freshman class was seated at Western.
That's correct.
Because I remember being there as the president of CVMA, welcoming the first class at Western in, God, I think it was a tent somewhere, but anyhow, way back when.
Yeah, but seating a class ignores the preparation to bring the class in. And, even now, Rowan is going through a lot of planning, but they don't have a class yet. And even then, even though Dr. Johnson started work in 96, it's hard to be ready when that first class comes in. But at the same time, people took the same numbers and blamed Western for that drop in the applicant pool, when in actuality, that drop in the applicant pool was because, as a profession, we didn't have our act together. As a matter of fact, at that time, if you remember, one of the common complaints within the profession was that we were our own worst enemy. We weren't practicing good business, and the people who were suffering were telling everybody that they knew, don't go into veterinary medicine. It's not a viable profession.
Yeah, well, the mega study, which was released in 1999, the first study, talked about a shortage of veterinarians, or there might be an overabundance of veterinarians. I mean, it was this discussion of workforce has been an ongoing discussion for a number of years. You were talking about that 7 years between 96 and 2003. Those people who are involved with the education side of things, like yourself or Shirley Johnson, know how much work goes in. The rest of us who are, back then I was in clinical practice, really have no clue. So there's a quiet period between, let's say, 96, 97, and the first applications that are being accepted in 2002, 2003. So we really had no clue what was going on. And I would suggest that even with these new colleges such as Rowan and Arkansas, Long Island, Clemson, Texas Tech, all of these new schools that have opened, we don't know what the talks were like. I don't know personally, don't know what the talks were like that had been going on for a number of years prior to them hitting headline news.
What we do know is that there had to be a planning period for the curriculum, what type of curriculum you're going to have. Right. There had to be time to hire enough faculty to teach that first year class, as well as a plan to hire faculty in time for each maturation of the matriculation of the classes. But then again, I also don't know how to build a car.
Well, that's true.
That's
true. But you made an interesting point there, because you were talking about hiring faculty. And now, right now, with all of these new veterinary schools and the existing veterinary schools and this shortage of clinical veterinarians, how are we going to be able to supply sufficient clinicians to teach and not all teaching is done by clinicians. Some of them are PhDs that do the teaching. But how are we going to find enough people to teach in these new schools? Or, and maybe it's a two-part question, or is there a different education model that allows it to be less labor intensive?
So I'm not so sure about your definition of labor intensiveness.
Mm-hmm.
I do believe that there may be some models that will allow for greater instructional efficiencies, but that may be even more labor intensive for the faculty that are involved in that. Quite a few years ago, there was a conference at Davis that was, I'm losing the name of the nonprofit that sponsored it. But they were looking at the future of veterinary medicine, essentially.
The Pew Report?
The Pew Report, that's it, thank you. And in it, I think AAVMC finally recognized that every school can't be everything to all people. That we needed to learn how to share our strengths instead of trying to mimic every strength at every institution. And I realize this is a long way around to answering your question, but the challenge we have in veterinary medicine as opposed to human medicine is the multiple species that we must become comfortable with, competent in. And we don't have time, but that leads to whether you want to have limited licensure or targeted education or not. And I happen to be a proponent that says that essentially sticks to the point that the value of today's veterinarian is the fact that they are a generalist biologist with medical training. And it is through their practice that they become specialists. But having been trained as a generalist, it is easier for us to pivot when we have to provide people power to address a national concern like BSE or some other threat to our food supply in short order. But there are pros and cons to both sides of that argument. But back to the question in particular, we have a challenge in that, even though you said that clinicians are not the only ones that teach in a veterinary school, and you mentioned PhDs can teach some of it too, and yet there is a voltage drop when it comes to a non-DVM PhD and the understanding of the species that we have to understand. And so that exaggerates our challenge in recruiting appropriate faculty to provide that teaching. Now we can extend the influence of the best dermatologists we have, or the best cardiologists we have, or the best, you name it, ologists we have across the country through digital technology. But that doesn't solve our problem. And in academia in general, we've done a very poor job of promoting academia as a viable option for occupation. There are advantages to being in academia in terms of lifestyle, et cetera. But when a student graduates with nearly $100,000 or more in debt, they might not be able to service that debt in academia if it weren't for the federal payment plan that is available for people who teach. Be that as it may, it's not attractive when you're getting $100,000 signing bonuses to go into a practice somewhere. I've never been able to provide that to anybody that I hired at Western. It's going to be a challenge. I'm interested in that as much as you are. I don't know where Eleanor is going to find these faculty, unless she has a lot of friends at Texas A&M who are willing to move to Arkansas. And the same is going to go for Rowan, and the same is going to go for Utah, who has to add faculty for for the last 2 years of their program. Now, what this means is that just as in practice, seasoned faculty members are now going to be attractive, and so from a market perspective, salaries should look good, except that many of these markets in veterinary schools are being supported by public coffers, and public HRs are totally different than private HRs. And so that's going to be an interesting environment to watch as well. I don't think that salaries are going to respond to the market in a public university the way practice salaries have responded to the market. There are other brakes on the funding of salaries from public coffers that we don't, as a profession, don't have a lot of control over, which makes it that much more difficult to recruit and attract people to academia. Now, we are just talking about the fiscal part of it. I'm sitting here wondering, what is the governor of Arkansas and the legislature of Arkansas doing to higher education? Are they following Texas's trend and attacking tenure and attacking libraries and attacking freedom of speech? Because if they are, that just makes it that much harder to bring new people into academia. University of Texas in Austin, the president essentially told the legislature that he lost 5 star recruits because of the recent bills that were passed by the Texas legislature, because they don't want to move their families to an environment where they interpret instability and potential interference in their job.
You mentioned salaries. And so the 4th year in a traditional university is clinical. And the faculty who teach at the university are salaried clinicians. In veterinary medicine, we really don't give them an opportunity, the 4th year clinicians, the specialist neurologists, ophthalmologists, et cetera, to make as much money as somebody in private practice. I mean, you can't compete in that situation. But in human healthcare, and correct me if I'm wrong, at least at some of the teaching hospitals, those doctors do have a capacity and an ability to make money as a specialist above and beyond their income from a teaching standpoint. Is there any thought of allowing for 4th year clinical staff, boarded people, specialists especially, to have income streams to supplement their teaching salaries beyond research?
Yes. And there's more than a thought. Some schools have been able to collar that dragon. The problem with clinical instruction, and I'm a former clinical teacher, is that if you're a good clinician and a good teacher, from an administration standpoint, you have to learn to divide the functions. And you have to understand that for a clinician to maintain their skills and their competence in their chosen discipline, they must be allowed to practice. And while practicing, they are sharing their knowledge with the student as part of their training. And this is where the distributive model essentially allows for that dyad approach. The people who suffer the most are those who commit to academia, right? Now, it gets muddled as to whether or not you have a teaching hospital or not. In some hospitals, and by the way, we aren't just talking about 4th year. We're talking about clinical training wherever it occurs.
Right.
Okay, so let's not just think of, because you have clinicians who teach preventative care or primary care who are just as important, right? And what we have to do is develop a model where they participate in the profit sharing of that hospital. And it gets muddled in the fact that the university says, well, I built the hospital the university, you didn't come in and borrow money to build a hospital. The university built this hospital, and the university controls the budget, and the university pays you a salary. What we haven't done very well is without creating a two-tier system among faculty, is to point out the differences between a basic science faculty member who teaches physiology, has a DVM and a PhD in physiology, and has focused on the physiology of therogenology, but doesn't have to do emergency duty, doesn't have to respond to patient needs or to owner needs. What we have to do is to identify that that's a separate function that is aligned with clinical training that should be paid for by the people we serve. And the profit that we generate from that should be shared with the people who are providing those services. Nobody yet has come up with a really fair plan where the university gets its money back for running the hospital, and the share is actually considered equitable for the individual faculty member who's actually delivering the service. On top of that, as citizens, we get confused when our taxpayer dollars help pay for that hospital and the people in it. And so all of a sudden now we don't charge as much for our services at a teaching hospital in a state-supported school as a private practitioner may charge, which further cuts into the pie or makes the pie smaller. These are the issues that we have been wrestling with as long as I have been in academia. Some schools do a better job at it than others.
Okay, so I want to wrap up this discussion with one question that is going to test you, challenge you, and make you think.
So you haven't done that yet?
No, I haven't done that yet.
Why do I feel so tired?
Yeah, I know. You're gonna be retired when I ask this question. Put your thinking cap on and tell me what you think veterinary education is going to look like when you and I are in walkers and defibrillators and oxygen 15 years down the road.
Now, first of all, my crystal ball doesn't go past 3 years. But I'll take a stab at it.
All right, please do.
I think there are going to be some disciplines, and I think there's already a move toward this, where the seat of the discipline, of learning of the discipline, is going to be in the colleges of the discipline rather than in the veterinary colleges. And the discipline colleges will be contracting essentially with the veterinary colleges to provide training in their given area. I think that when I look at certain disciplines like radiology and pathology, those disciplines where digital technology is rapidly becoming online services and internet services, it shouldn't be hard to imagine that the distribution of knowledge will also be that way. We're already taking advantage of that in our distributive model at Western, because our students are learning with some of the best pathologists in the nation through Antech. But when they have rounds, pathologists that they're meeting with online are from the East Coast, Middle America, and California. And nobody's in the room but the group of students that happen to be at Antech. But there's a base of knowledge that I hope we understand our graduates must have to be competent when they graduate. We can't get a radiologist. Very few schools have an acceptable core of radiologists on their campus now, unless they have significant buying power for technology, et cetera. And it's not just happening in America, it's happening in Europe too. But essentially, there are now radiological services provided by radiology companies that many practitioners take advantage of. And now they're beginning to band together and provide micro lectures and other types of training that they can deliver digitally, and then offer travel radiologists essentially to come around and teach technique, etc. There's also the possibility that the role of the veterinary technician will suddenly expand in teaching, so that the physical technical skill required in preparing pathological specimen or taking a radiograph or an ultrasound, etc., can be transferred, taught, transmitted by technicians rather than the boarded radiologist. The interpretation, however, of that product still must be, or should be, the expert in the field. We're going to be using virtual reality for a lot of clinical training, but there is nothing that will replace preparation for intervention in a live patient. Requires experience with live patients. And so I don't see much of a change there. I do see a larger movement toward providing those experiences in real life, real work environment, the way we're doing it. But that's what I see happening in the next 15 years.
All right, so I lied. I have one more question.
I'm too tired now. I'm retired now.
Okay, you have a platform now. I'm going to give you 30 seconds, which I know is hard, but you have 30 seconds to talk to the audience and convince them, whatever stage they may be in their career, that they would be a great asset on faculty at a veterinary school. This is 30 seconds to recruit our listeners to become future educators.
I need more than 30 seconds because the advantages of academic medicine are too numerous to list in 30 seconds. But I will say this: it doesn't matter where you are in your career. Academic veterinary medicine, or more importantly, the future of the profession, is based on our ability to power the development of the future veterinarian. So I encourage everyone to be involved in that.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. That was great conversation.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too. Thank you, Dr. Weinstein. And I'd also like to thank Nationwide for putting up with us and giving us the time to get together and talk about issues that matter to our profession and to our society.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.